Another interesting concept of Terraform is variables. So you can actually use variables inside the configuration file. So for example, let's say we want a value of CIDR block not to be hard-coded here, but we want to pass it as a parameter. In this case, we can actually define a variable for this CIDR block and then reference that variable and its value right here. And this could be pretty handy, especially if you have values that are used multiple times for different resources, or if you want to reuse the configuration files of Terraform for multiple different environments and you want to pass in different parameters for different use cases, right? For example, have the same template for development and production environments where you can basically just define all these values like namings, etc. as parameters and pass it from outside. So what we're going to do is, to make it very simple, we're going to use a variable for CIDR block of the subnet. So I'm going to remove it right here. And the variables in Terraform are defined with variable keyword. And we're going to name the variable whatever we want. Let's actually call it subnet CIDR block. And inside the variable definition, we have a possibility to define several attributes. And we're just gonna go with a description that basically describes what the variable is about. And we can basically just repeat that, CIDR block. And this defines our variable. And now we can use that variable as a value right here. And the way we do that is using var dot and the variable name. So as you see, the syntax is really consistent throughout. So whether we're defining resource or data or variable, the actual syntax is actually pretty similar, right? We have the keyword, then we have the name, and we have this block where we pass in parameters and also referencing resources or data or variables. It's all pretty consistent, right? For data, we had data dot name of that data. For variable, we have var dot variable name. So we have defined a variable and we have referenced that variable right here. However, we haven't assigned a value to our variable. And this should actually be equals sign. Now there are three ways of assigning a value to a variable. So the first way to assign a variable value is when we do Terraform apply, we get a prompt for entering the CIDR block, right? So this is the variable name or reference, and we're expected to enter a value, right? Let's actually do 10.0.20. And here you see the changes that will be made because we actually have both of these resources, VPC and subnet, existing. So we are making a change to the CIDR block. So what we see in Terraform output is that the subnet will get removed and then recreated because we are making change to the CIDR block. And if we do yes, the old subnet got destroyed because you can't change the CIDR block on an existing subnet. So it removed the old one and created a new one with a new ID. And if we go to AWS, this was the old subnet, and refresh. This is the new one with a new CIDR block. So this is one way to assign variable, but this is obviously not the efficient way. This could be for testing or just trying out a new value. However, for long term, if you want to automate your processes, we have to define the variables without having a user prompt. So the second way of passing in a variable is using command line argument in Terraform apply. So if we do Terraform apply, and we're leaving the configuration as is because the variable is still not assigned, so we can actually assign it again with Terraform apply -var, and as an argument we can pass in the name of the variable, which is this name right here, and the value, which let's set it to something different. Let's do 30, and now if I execute this, we see the same output. So basically the CIDR block needs to be changed from this to the new one that we defined. So the subnet will be destroyed and a new one will be created. So this time we're not prompted for an input. And if we do yes and refresh, there you go, a new subnet got created with a new CIDR block. And there is a last and actually the most efficient or the most correct way of assigning values to variables, and this is actually a best practice that you should be using most of the time. And the third way is defining variables file and assigning values to all the variables for your Terraform configuration inside that file. And that file in Terraform actually has its own naming convention and file ending. So let's create this file. And the name, the default name, which Terraform will automatically find and recognize as a variables file, is terraform.tfvars. So let's enter. So the file ending or extension must be tfvars. And if we name file Terraform, Terraform will be able to automatically find and recognize it as a vars or variables file. And inside this file, we can define key value pairs for our variables. So we have the variable name equals the value of that variable. And in this case, let's actually set it to 040/24 and save it. And now if we apply that, and we don't need to pass in a variable option or enter a value as a prompt, Terraform will basically automatically find that variables file and read the variable value from that file and set it here. So let's see. And there you go. We have the review that the CIDR block is getting changed from this to this value that we have defined in the tfvars file, and we can confirm. And there you go. Let's refresh. Here we have the new CIDR block. So as I said, this is actually the correct way, or a way that you should be using in most of the cases for assigning variables. And obviously you can define multiple variables in here. Let's actually extract this as well as a variable. And let's call it VPC CIDR block. And we're gonna reference it again with var VPC CIDR block. And by the way, this autocomplete that I get here is from the plugin, the Terraform plugin that I have installed in my Visual Code, which helps a lot in typing. So we have a second variable, which is called VPC CIDR block. So VPC CIDR block. We can assign it a value that was originally stated, but set it here instead. And this way we can actually make the whole configuration, or almost all of the configuration, parameterized and reusable, so that depending on the use case, we can pass in the respective values. One of the cases for that is if we have a configuration file or multiple configuration files that create a bunch of resources and basically just create the whole infrastructure with the VPC and security groups, etc. And if we want to replicate the same exact infrastructure as, let's say, a development environment, a staging environment, and production environment, we can have these configuration files for all three environments and then change parameters based on which environment we are in. For example, names, so basically just referencing as environment. So we would have a variable called environment, and we can describe it as, well, let's say deployment environment, and then define these values in the variables file. And you would do the same for all the other tags and also make the resource names more generic, like my app VPC instead of development VPC, so that the configuration is reusable for different environments. And based on which environment you're applying to, you would basically substitute the value. Now, in this case, you would have variable files for all three environments, right? You would have a variables file for development, production, and staging. So this would be Terraform dev, for example, and all the values for development environment will be set here. And then you would have Terraform prod.tfvars, for example, with all the prod values. Now, if we change the name of this variables file from Terraform to something else, in this case Terraform-dev, then we need to pass the file name as a parameter when we apply. So now if we do Terraform apply without passing in the file name, see, it prompts us for the variable value, right? Because Terraform cannot find a variables file because it's looking for terraform.tfvars. So let's actually just break it and abort the apply. So instead, we do that by setting a flag for file and the name of the file that we are passing. In our case, Terraform dev.tfvars, and apply. And as you see, Terraform was able to get the variables defined here. So it didn't prompt us for input. And since we didn't make any changes, there is nothing to apply. So apply complete with no changes. So this is how you can use variables in your configuration file and how you can make your configuration of resources reusable for different environments, for different use cases by passing in variables using this variables file. So I have removed all the variables except for the subnet CIDR block. And there are two more characteristics or things to explain about variables. The first one is that we can assign variables default values. So inside this block here, we can do default, and default attribute will get a value. Let's set it to 0, 10, 0. Let's say this is the default value. And here we have a value defined for CIDR block as 10, 0, 50, 0. Now, the default value will kick in if Terraform cannot find a value defined for that variable, either in the variables file or as a command line parameter. In this case, it will not prompt you for a value, it will just take the default, right? So if we removed it here, or basically we just didn't provide the Terraform dev file name, then this value will be taken. And this is also pretty handy if you have the configuration that should work as a default setup, and then you allow different users for different use cases to pass in parameters to override the default. So for example, development configuration could be the default, and then you would have variable files for other environments. Or it could be production, and then you have development and staging variable files. And the second thing you can do with variables is set a variable type, right? So we have the type attribute, which can have multiple different values. It could be a Boolean, it could be string, it could be a number. So for example, for the CIDR block, it is a string. And maybe for most of the cases, you won't need a type, or you may just leave it blank. However, if you have some value that has to be of a certain type, and you want the users of your configuration files that basically pass in values through the variables file, for example, or as command line option, you want them to know that this variable has to have this type, so you kind of enforce that for the users. So you have the option of setting a type for your variables. So in this case, if someone passed in an array, for example, instead, like this, then Terraform will give an error because it expects a string. Let's actually try this out. And there you go, invalid value for input variable, because it needs to be a string. So string required, but we're passing it an array or a list. So let's say that we want this variable to be a list that contains multiple CIDR blocks, right? In this case, we can define the type as a list of strings. And let's actually remove the default. And let's say these are just CIDR blocks for VPC and subnets. And let's call it CIDR blocks. And now it expects us to give a list of CIDR blocks. So I'm going to copy the name, let's set it here, and we can pass in the values, right? Let's say the first one is 10.0.0.0. That's what we had for the VPC, and this is for one of its subnets. And let's actually set it to 10. And now we have a variable which holds a list. So we have to change how we reference that variable. First of all, let's change the name. And second of all, this will basically give us the whole list, right? So in CIDR block, in subnet, we need the second element. So with var.CIDR blocks, we're referencing the whole list, right? But we just need the second element of that list. So we can access it by using very simple list syntax with an index of 1. This is the second element, and then we're going to have CIDR blocks index of 0. This is the first element as a VPC block, right? So the first one is VPC, second one is subnet. And let's execute it. And there you go, we see that subnet will get replaced because we didn't change the IP range of VPC, so it will stay the same, and we can confirm it. So now our subnet has a new CIDR block. We can also have objects as variables in Terraform. So for example, here instead of strings, or instead of a list of strings, we can actually have a list of objects as well. So let's say this is a CIDR block attribute, and then we have a name attribute, for example, and let's call it dev VPC. And the same here. Dev subnet. So basically we have a list of objects right here, and each object here has CIDR block attribute and name attribute. And of course, now we have to adjust the usage of this variable in main.tf. So first of all, we could also validate a list of objects using a list of object type like this. So obviously, if you just had object, you could do this, but we have a list of objects, and you can validate the object attributes inside as well. So you could do this, and then we have two attributes, cider block, and we can say this needs to be a string, and we have name, which also needs to be a string. So this way we can actually validate the whole object, and we can say this should be a list of objects with these attributes which have string type. Again, a use case for this is if you are creating configuration files and then you let other team members maybe use those configuration files by passing in different parameters as variables. So you may want to restrict or give them guidelines to what values they can pass in as parameters. So basically you can define this type here. If you just leave it empty, basically they can put in whatever type they want. So let's set the type for it. And now we have to access the variable values differently. So accessing the first element will be done with this. So cider blocks index 0. So basically we're fetching the first element, which is the whole object here, right? It's not just cider block value, but it's the whole object. So in order to get the cider block value out of it, we have to reference the object attribute. So we're going to do dot cider block. And then we also have name defined, right? So we can access the name using the name attribute like this. And we could do the same right here, cider block. You see I have autocomplete suggestion as well as name attribute right here. And this will be a variable that has cider blocks and names or name tags for VPC and subnet. So these are a couple of different ways of how to use variables in Terraform.